Thanks, Margot, and for the introduction, and Nicola for inviting me to present. I'm very excited about this initiative, the SAMNet initiative. I think it's going to produce a lot of good fruit going forward. And Charles, really nice introduction. I think you covered all the issues that I found with me and my colleague found when we were working on this. And actually, I mean, we focus on one specific methodology, but we're also a bunch of us at the Department of Economics have also now basically doing what you're doing and what Nicola has done before. And, you know, we're running into a lot of the same questions. So it's nice to see that, and we should actually collaborate and get in touch a little bit more going forward. I'm just going to share my screen quickly. Let me do that. Are the slides showing?
Yes, looking good.
Okay. There we go. All right. I just want to minimize. There we go. So the title of this paper that I did that with my co-author, Ruan Erasmus, unfortunately, yes, he was supposed to present this, but he got in touch with me just on Sunday evening that he is ill. It sounds like he might have COVID. So that was pretty unfortunate. So I had to jump in here to assist him. But yeah, so that's why I'm talking today and not him, as you might have seen on the program. So we're, yes, following a very similar approach to what Charles has been thinking about here. And we're taking a little bit more, one step further, and we're actually trying to look at the policy relevance for it. So it's actually a nice, really nice follow on from what Charles just discussed, because we're trying to see how does the language in the Monetary Policy Committee statements, how once we tokenize them, once we take this qualitative information and put a quantitative value to it, how does it, how well does it explain future policy changes by the South African Reserve Bank? And so we call this a forward guidance indicator. And essentially, I mean, I think a lot of us know this, that there's been a major shift in the communication strategy of central banks over the last few decades. And, you know, up until the 1990s, it was mainly focused on credibility and accountability. You know, we went from, you know, thinking that monetary policy, optimal monetary policy needed to be opaque. You needed to surprise the markets, right? So it went from this opacity to transparency, from surprising markets to explaining your actions. And then there was this emphasis on building trust and engagement. And you also saw this a lot in the Fed during the Volcker period. And then more recently, with the introduction of inflation targeting, right, that got widely adopted in the 1990s, first by New Zealand, and then many other countries in South Africa in 2001 or 2000. And then the global financial crisis with the zero lower bound, as was mentioned, I think, by Andrea in the discussion just now, that the communication became a tool. So central banks realized that they could use their communication to affect not only expectations about the path of the interest rate going forward and their stance of policy going forward, but also to directly impact inflation expectations. So I think it's important to realize that it's an explicit tool of monetary policy now. And it may not need, and I've mentioned this in the chat as well, it's not only useful at the zero low bound when monetary policy may be ineffective. It's also useful when you have an inflation targeting regime, right? Because you have a clear mandate and a clear target, and you can help do it. I think it's been referred to by I think Scott Sumner. It's called the Chuck Norris effect, right? So markets do all the heavy lifting for the central bank. And this is also why we're having quite a big problem with identification of monetary policy shocks, right? So you see paper after paper looking at monetary policy shocks before the financial crisis and after, and a lot of it says, oh, look, monetary policy shocks affect inflation less. This doesn't mean monetary policy is ineffective. It actually might mean that monetary policy has just become more endogenous and more effective, right? There's a whole nother set of research that looks at, how inflation during the period of secular stagnation is anchored and de-anchored from monetary policy, the Phillips curve discussion and all of that. But yeah, so it's got a big role in how we think about the effectiveness of monetary policy. So now that it is an instrument, it's here to stay. It's not going away, and then we can think about how it's being used. So historically, you've mainly got a lot more qualitative, right? So this is what Charles has been talking about, taking the qualitative content of speeches and statements and quantifying them, and then trying to see what kind of information they contain. But there's also quantitative forward guidance by the central banks, and this is explicit information about the future path of the instrument, which is in most cases going to be the repo rate or the policy rate. In South Africa, it's the repo rate. South Africa does both of this. They have the QPM model that gives projections for the repo rate, but their main medium of forward guidance, I would say, Nicola can correct me on this, is their monetary policy committee statements. So we're focusing on this qualitative side. Something we didn't do, that in case I forget, because you'll see maybe later, is that I think it would be very interesting to assess whether the qualitative communication of the South African Reserve Bank matches its quantitative projections for the repo rate. Because we know that there are forecast errors and misses. So while we might see that qualitative communication does not necessarily predict out of sample repo changes, it may predict the forecasts of the central bank. So do their qualitative and quantitative communication or forward guidance, do they match? That's a separate thing, but just put a pin in that. So going forward, again, you have these two styles of forward guidance communication, and it will remain about prediction. That's the main thing. I think Blinder has spoken about this, and a number of others, that, being Odyssean, I don't like these Greek terms, but it seems to have stuck. But, tying yourself to the mast and being committed and being very explicit about what you're going to do going forward is probably not what central banks are going to do. There were some instances by the Fed, the Evans rule, that kind of leaned more on these explicit commitments. Draghi famously says, do whatever it takes. But these are contingent on the state of the economy. So, the central bank's communication tends to be more on this stealthic side, where it's more about the implied path. Charles' point about the momentum of narratives is really important, and how that actually changes over time. So that's very interesting work there. So this forward guidance indicator is essentially based on the idea that communication by the central bank on their stance can be translated or can be put into a quantitative measure, a sentiment index, right? And this can be used to identify the direction and the magnitude in which they intend to influence markets, right? I mentioned through inflation expectations or interest rates. And also can be used to evaluate how consistent and effective the central bank has communicated its monetary policy. And the second point has actually been addressed in the only paper up until now where Nicola and Charles and Coco, Alberto, Coco, and Nicola in the other paper have now kind of come back to this literature, but Reid and Plessis is the only paper for South Africa that tried to do this. And they call this a monetary policy inclination index, which may be kind of, it speaks to the second point here I mentioned about how consistent and effective they've been. And what they do here is actually, this is a subjective grading. So they, Monique and Stan, they read through all the statements up until scored them independently and looked at their scores and came up with, this index. So what we do going forward is actually we incorporate this series and also compare it to the results we get. So that's just an example about, sorry, and this graph is basically showing this monetary inclination index, which we can also call a forward guidance indicator. And the changes there are the red line, and they're discrete, these discrete jumps, because their series is discrete. And the shaded areas behind that are the monetary policy changes, the contemporaneous changes in each point in time. And just eyeballing it, you can see there appears to be, a close correlation between large changes at least. So what is the key aim of our paper? We want to construct forward guidance indicators, all right, based on the sentiment, which we describe as being hawkish, right? So there's the stance is contraction, or there's an inflationary expectation. So the central bank is being hawkish, neutral, and dovish. From these monetary policy committee statements, and we use this text mining technique, or a bag of words approach, which is just one of the approaches that Charles mentioned. And then we want to look, and I'll take this a step further. What's the policy relevance of this? And we determine whether these forward guidance indicators have predictive power or explanatory power, thinking about in sample, for future changes in the repo rate. And then we also are interested in finding out, because the statements of the Monetary Policy Committee incorporate the context of the South African economy, business cycle, financial cycle, whatever issues might arise, and you maybe saw some of this in Charles' presentation about the topics, right? So this information content about the macroeconomic position of South Africa. So we also want to regress the FG idea that they should reflect, for example, inflation expectations, like something that the SARB cares about. So what are the main findings? I just brushed through them quickly so you have a good idea about what we do, and in case I also run out of time, then you know what we try to do. So firstly, we find that these forward guidance indicators provide significant explanatory power for future changes in the repurchase rate, which is the primary monetary policy instrument. And also that these FGIs are primarily driven by the inflation expectations, which we use the average of the trade unions and business people and financial analysts from the BER. And this highlights a strong link between the South African Reserve Bank's communication strategy and its inflation mandate. We also found that the confidence indices that the BER release could also be important determinants of these forward guidance indicators, but they would only become important for very large deviations. So the coefficient is quite small, but because the index typically for business confidence, I think, is between negative 100 and 100, and consumer confidence is 0 and 100, all the other way around. So that's just some of the policy and kind of economic results. But we also do a lot of robustness checks. And it turns out, just like Charles pointed out, that the selection of your dictionary that you use to analyze the text matters a lot. And I'll show some of the distributions, and you'll see that at the moment. And then the second point that, again, also Charles pointed out, was the possibility that the stance of monetary policy is asymmetric, in the sense that when they are hawkish, their communication is different from when they are dovish. So we decompose our index into their positive and negative components. And we do find some evidence of asymmetries, and in particular, the kind of anti-inflation asymmetry. So in other words, hawkish sentiment is more significant statistically than dovish statements, right? So when the SARB is talking against inflation, there tends to be much more clearer communication than if it's if there's like slack in the economy and they take an accommodative stance. And I think there's a general anti-inflation bias of central banks, and we do find this both absolutely and asymmetrically. So even the level of the index highlights this anti-inflation bias. And again, with the asymmetries, we based on the selection of dictionaries, it's also then matters what position you are in the index. So our index goes between 2 and negative 2, 2 positive being hawkish and negative being dovish. And the one index that performs the best for us. It doesn't matter what position you are in, produces very similar results. It turns out that, whether you're at 1 or 2 or -1 or -2, it actually does have a bearing on the predictability of the forward guidance for future repo rate changes. Another interesting finding, and I think this goes back to the idea about monetary policy shocks, that changes in monetary policy, you could start with the assumption that they are by definition exogenous. So you're trying to forecast a discrete variable that is exogenous, unless the markets are pricing in and the central bank, and no new shocks have arrived, etc., then possibly not. So we do find that I've given overall interpretation for this finding that, the monetary policy commitment statements reflect relevant information on the current inflationary stance and policy decisions by the South African Reserve Bank. But since these forecasts, based on the QPM or based on kind of where the MPC sees the policy going forward, they are conditional on current information. So by inherently, they will provide unreliable forward guidance. Maybe that's a bit too strong, I don't know, but this is how we've kind of formulated the idea, in particular about the information of the future path of the policy rate. That's what we're focusing on. And yeah, we provide some policy advice that Nicola, we'll just skip over that. So yes, there has been quite a bit of literature that has emerged on text mining techniques and central bank communication. As I've mentioned, Reid and Plessis, the one that in South Africa in the literature that uses manual coding. We take this bag of words approach, this dictionary approach, and there's all sorts of other supervised machine learning methods, LDA, that Charles has mentioned, and Nicola and Viegi and Alberto Coco. I actually didn't know that they were working on this, but we happen to be working on this topic at exactly the same time. They also incorporate some bag of words approach, and if I'm staying correct, I remember it was more of a qualitative nature, describing the stance of monetary policy. So where our kind of contribution here is to explicitly measure the statistical relevance of the forward guidance indicator to predict policy rate changes. Okay, so this bag of word approach is, it's an existing dictionary that has a predefined list of words and or phrases. We actually just look at single words. So there's an obvious extension here to n-grams, so multiple words or bigrams. But again, Shaw pointed this out nicely, that there's a lot more subjectivity that goes in here. So we wanted to keep our subjectivity limited, and we also wanted to start with something more simple. So we just have single words that are tokenized, and we use 3 different dictionaries. What are the advantages of this, at least compared to Reid and Plessis, is that this overcomes the subjectivity associated with manual classification of statements. So you read the monetary policy statement and you infer the stance of monetary policy going forward based on that yourself or a team. So you kind of removing that bias that might occur in real time. So the disadvantages of these dictionaries are selected by us. They're also constructed by other people. There are vetting processes. And what we do show is, again, that the selection of dictionary does matter, okay? The simple bag of words approach does not account for context. This was emphasized as well in Charles' presentation. And there are ways that you can try and think about how to incorporate more context going forward. Yeah, and there's some other you might have redundant words or absence of keywords. And actually what I'll point out, you'll see in the one dictionary that it's quite popular, the Loughran dictionary, it's a finance dictionary. It's heavily skewed towards negative words. And so your FGI index is also very, very much skewed. I think they've updated this Loughran dictionary recently. So yeah, but I would say be cautious about using it. for at least this kind of work. So what do? We're looking at the SARB monetary policy statements that occur like bi-monthly or every 8 to 9 weeks. It's not always regular, and it's covering the inflation targeting regime from 2000 to 2018. And what we do, we checked both an augmented and an unaugmented series. In other words, we looked at a series where only where the observed MPC statements occur do we look at the monetary policy changes. And then we have an augmented series where we assume that the stance of policy from each meeting and what index value it gives, that stays constant until the next meeting. And so we use that series so we can actually have a full monthly sample from March to November in 2018. So these are the important economic data that we use for our analysis. I will get to that again. So there's 2 steps in our methodology. We need to then read the MPC documents and kind of tokenize each word so that each word or text is put into a kind of data frame. And you will remove a number of redundant words, stop words. It's called it, the, and you'll also do some case folding, removing uppercases, etc. And there are also some special characters, punctuation, rare words, and a lot of this is actually automatable in R. I think Charles used Python, but you can also use this in R as well. Yeah. So how do we construct our index? We use the 3 different dictionaries: Henry, Loughran, and Christensen. Hawkish words. So that means words in the monetary policy statements that match to positive words identified in the dictionary, and then also negative words. Sorry, hawkish being negative sentiment, and dovish being positive words and sentiment. And so we can just total up these number of words, look at the difference as a share of the total. And the reason why we multiply this by 2, it's just a scalar, but it just happens that we wanted to compare our results to Reid and Plessis, who also use an index between 2 and -2. Okay, but this is just a scaling up and down. All right, so here we have the distribution of the mean value of, for example, our Henry dictionary. You can see that it's above 0. So this, in a sense, is kind of like indicating the anti-inflation stance of monetary policy communication being more hawkish, right? So their communicated stance tends to be biased towards positive sentiment about inflation rising. I actually got this mixed up earlier when I was talking about this. Hawkish is obviously if your sentiment is positive about inflation rising, for example, or maybe about growth rising, and dovish would be if your stance is accommodative and that you don't expect inflation, let's say, to be outside above your target band, right? So the monetary policy stance will be accommodative. So here the stance of monetary policy in terms of its mean, more hawkish, all right? And dictionary being about 85 negative and 100 positive, fairly evenly balanced. It produces kind of, right? And if we look at that's not too far off 0. It is positive, but it's not too far off 0. Then if you look at something like the Loughran dictionary, which has a much larger number of negative words, you'll see that the dictionary, at least in terms of its mean, also has a very much wider distribution. And then this Christensen dictionary, which I got through a research associate that we had here and that I invited down a couple of years ago, and we started talking about this. He was also working on this in the private sector, and he actually just read through policy statements and underlined negative and positive words. So this is, in a sense, the most naive type of dictionary you could come up with, and it actually, we find that it corresponds much more closely to the Henry dictionary, which has been vetted. Okay, so what we do find, we actually get rid of the Lofgren results. That it doesn't work well at all. And dictionary. This is just that same plot that, like I showed you earlier with Monique Reid's monetary inclination index. And you see, this is a continuous series. There's actually no discrete changes. And also, it's quite different from what the kind of subjective measuring that was done in Reid and du Plessis. But we see that there is still some increases in the repo rate, that the index is a bit higher, and when you have decreases, you have this kind of lower values. So this is just eyeballing and plotting the series just to get an idea. There you see the Lofgren dictionary. You can also see that how that distribution came out lower. Okay, I'll just skip over that. We also, just as a kind of a litmus test, we check the correlation between our FGIs and repo rate, the level and changes at various horizons, right? Because the idea is that this forward guidance by the central bank should be correlated to future changes in the repo rate, or the level of the repo rate going forward. What we notice here is that, you know, our Henry dictionary, for example, is very similar in terms of correlation with Reid and du Plessis. The reason why it's a little bit higher here and here is this is a reduced sample for Reid and du Plessis, which only goes up to 2008, whereas for Henry, this is the full sample. If we use the reduced sample, these values are even closer, the correlations. Okay, again, just getting an idea that, you know, what we would expect is that increases in the FGI, right, a more hawkish sentiment by the central bank will lead to increases in the repo rate. Okay. So for our first application, we regress the changes in the repo rate at various horizons on our FGI, as well as two other explanatory variables. One is the domestic expectations of future short-term interest rates. These are the two-year ahead swap rates, as well as in a technical dummy that is included for basically 9/11, as well as there was a technical change in the repo rate at that point, but it actually comes out to be statistically significant. But the main idea is here, we want to control for market expectations, as this is containing, by assumption, we can assume all relevant information that is at hand in the markets. And then we want to know, does the communication of the central bank at that point in time provide any additional information on the future repo rate changes? Okay, and so this is an in-sample, right? So this is the in-sample analysis. And we do see that the FGI does produce statistically significant information about future repo rate changes. And obviously, as the horizon goes further, up to 6 months, you know, the monetary policy meeting would probably occur after 2 months, right? But there might be persistence in that communicated stance, and that's got to do with that momentum as well. And so let's say a unit increase in the FGI explains about a 50 basis point increase in the repo rate. And for domestic expectations, for example, that include, you know, the two-year ahead rate for 2 years, a percentage point increase there would be associated with a 87 basis point increase in the repo rate. And obviously we control for the level, as you saw that there is that kind of anti-inflation bias level. So this negative value here is capturing that shift in the level downwards. and the fit of the model also proves over the horizon. For the, how much time do I have left? Okay, good. I'll wrap up quickly. For the second application, we want to also see by, the statements of the monetary policy are meant to be based on the information, or at least the kind of state of the economy. And so what we do here is and not only the state, but the expected market expectations about the state of the economy as well. So we regress this FGI on business confidence and consumer confidence indices from the BER, as well as their inflation expectations series. And then also we include US market expectations for the short-term interest rate as well. So foreign monetary policy, the path of foreign monetary policy in a small open economy would also likely affect the kind of narrative of the central bank as well. And then we include a financial crisis dummy as well here. So what do we find here? That inflation expectations are kind of the driving factor in the FGI. So this was a nice result to get. This is what you wanted to get, which was good to see. We also see that, at least for the Christensen dictionary, that that business and consumer confidence does matter. This coefficient is very small, but like I mentioned earlier, that index ranges from 0 to 100 and negative 100 to 100. So if you do get large changes, like for example in the coronavirus pandemic now, this may become an important factor or not. And yes, these dummies are important as well, but that's not so relevant. So we also look at the non-linearities. So we want to also see whether the positive or negative components matter. But here specifically, we also want to know whether or not the position where you are in the index, does that matter or not? So this ordinal or cardinal, ordinal being, your position in the index, does that matter more? So how far you are away from being neutral in your stance? Does that matter, or does just the discrete or the changes matter in the index? And what we find here is for the Henry dictionary that you get statistically significant values for almost all the positions except for the first dummy for positives here, and the values are more or less similar, except that you do get this kind of more stronger response for the anti-inflation bias again. Okay, but we do test whether or not the difference between the coefficients is statistically significant, so that does it matter at which position you're in? And for the Henry dictionary, we cannot reject the null that the index is cardinal in nature. So is cardinal in nature. So that means that it's not likely that the position or where you are in the index matters very much. But again, for the Christensen dictionary, we do reject that. And again, these gave very quantitatively similar results, both of these dictionaries. So this is an interesting result, and it also highlights again why you can't just blindly approach this, I've got a nice new fancy technique and then apply it and then make inference from it. It really does matter what dictionary you use, and you need to be able to actually make sense. There needs to be judgment still by the researcher. I would definitely not just go into extending this to machine learning methods and then not putting judgment on the results. Yeah. So just some concluding remarks. I hope I haven't gone too much and no one has interrupted me. So we find that, yes, these FGIs do represent a useful tool to explain and predict future changes in the repo rate, right? So there is something there. And it's out of sample performance is very weak. Okay, what's nice to see that these FGIs are primarily driven by inflation expectations. Okay, And again, as I pointed out, that there are possibilities of nonlinearities. The dictionaries also do matter a lot. It does seem that the FGIs are robust to regime changes with inflationary targeting, which we didn't show here, something that Nicola pointed out in their working paper. And so the question then remains, and I agree 100% here with Charles, that if you're analyzing the South African Reserve Bank and you want to try to quantify their qualitative information from statements and speeches, actually, there's a lot more data that can be put together if you include all the governor's speeches and other information, which is what we're doing at the moment. But that you should actually train your dictionary or to fit the context of the country, of South Africa. And again, then there's many other complications here because obviously communication can change. But I think that as long as the central bank has an inflation targeting mandate and nothing institutional has changed significantly, so there's no regime change, moving from using instrument like interest rate to something else, that it should be the way to go in that sense, that you could tailor it to the South African Reserve Bank and you get a good approximation of the communicated stance of policy going forward. Thanks very much. I hope I didn't go too much over time.
No, not at all. Thank you so much, Hylton. That was really great, especially since, and thank you so much for coming in on such short notice. And we do hope that everyone feels better as soon as possible. Yes, thank you. I see there are some questions that are popping in, but perhaps this time, before we go to questions from the attendees, is there anything that any of the panelists would like to ask or say in the meantime?
Because I cannot raise my hand. There is not the raise hand option. I just wanted to, maybe I start so that while people think.
Okay.
Only one question. Only one question in relation to the auto sample. What we don't have, and this is also in the work with Charles, etc. We don't have a very clear idea what is the transmission mechanism of these informations. Therefore, if information is a different instrument, it might actually, is a bit like on the film, it might actually be a substitute of change of interest rate. Therefore, I can be more aggressive. I can give a very stronger that affect expectation. Therefore, that doesn't, when a new information read, don't need to change the instrument anymore. Therefore, I think that there is a sense of, how does information go through the system? Because obviously you do the forecast of the interest rate. But if I'm saying if the communication is a substitute, so it's not a complement of, but is a substitute the instrument, you might not, you actually don't have that change. Therefore, it's not a good predictor of the interest rate, but for example, might be a good predictor of where expectations are going or where, therefore is, I think, but this is part of sort of the open agenda, is really to think about how, especially when we do this analysis of text, etc., we don't have a clear structure in which we can insert this one and think about what is the transmission mechanism of this. This is just a general reflection of just to
yeah, but I really 100% agree, and I think the work on rational inattention in New Keynesian models, there's Cabet, there's a bunch of others, and sticky information, even Mankiw and Rice. That's definitely the way we need to go, because we do need to think very carefully about how information, how we can model it in our kind of consensus models. I think that's really important. So I agree with you on that a lot.
Cool, thank you. So there's a question from Kabetswe who would like to know more about the differences between the Henry, Loughran and Christensen dictionaries. And Kabetswe says, I presume they're all meant for finance and economic lexicon. Then also second question from Kabetswe, would combining the sentiments through a factor or some weighting technique help in any way, or do you want to see how the different lexicons perform?
Thanks, Kabetswe. Yes, so we did think about this. This is just the starting point where we wanted to look and assess at individual dictionaries. It's not obvious that combining them will solve anything. It appears that you need to be more directed in your approach, and that's why it's context specific. And I mentioned this, I really think that if you want to analyze the text of the SARB, you would need to use multiple approaches, from a bag of words to that combine single words with diagrams and phrases, as well as going to LDA, what Charles is doing, to looking at the topics, looking at other supervised machine learning methods, and really, and also try to tailor it to the context, to the South African Reserve Bank context. Because these dictionaries, so Henry is an economic dictionary, Loughran is, I think, primarily a finance dictionary, and as I mentioned, Christensen was, he's a private sector, he's a guy in the private sector that I met, and I invited him down to Stellenbosch a couple of years back. And what he was working on the private sector at the time, he was also trying to think about this, and we were talking about this, and basically he just read through all the statements he could find and underlined words, and got a research assistant to just write them up. So I thought it was, when I told Monique this, who's kind of our specialist for communication in the department, she was horrified. And then, and the point was that, well, look, this really ad hoc approach was not crazily off from our kind of main dictionary, which was this Henry dictionary. And then you had this Loughran dictionary, which you see a lot come up in the literature. A lot of people use them, and it's not clear that anyone questions it. That's what I've also found quite interesting. It didn't seem like we use this dictionary because other people have used it. And I think that was the kind of concern. So yes, you could combine them. It's not obvious that it would work better. Yeah. And then as I answer the next one, I think from Dawn, or
Yes.
you directing questions. Sorry, Margot.
No, it's fine. Yeah, you can. Just so that everyone.
Right.
So Don has asked. He says the Reserve Bank provides a repo forecast and emphasizes the conditionality of its forecasts in its communication. Should you control for Reserve Bank forecasts or changes in expectations from monetary policy statement communication when assessing the usefulness of the FGI to forecast repo changes? Good question. Thank you.
Yes, thanks. Yes, that's a great question, Don, and that's basically what I mentioned right in the beginning when I spoke about that. The SARB does do quantitative forward guidance, so to speak, and qualitative. And when we focus on the qualitative, what would be really interesting is, yes, one, to control to that, or to through its statements, it actually is matching their quantitative projections for the repo rate, right? So their repo forecast, that would actually maybe be a better, because you want to see, does their communication match the model that they're using, or are they actually quite divergent? So I definitely think that is a must, what you're saying here, to think about actually controlling for the quantitative measures that they have.
Great, thank you. So we have a question from one of our, from Andrea again. And yeah, over to you, Andrea. Oh, can you?
Thanks, Margot. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Great. Hylton, thanks. This is really, really good stuff. I really enjoyed this paper and the presentation, so thank you. A question that I suppose would resonate a bit with Nicola, given he's done some of this. Does the out of sample performance does it change under different governors? Right. So have you looked at the discrete regimes and seen maybe which how it performs under the different governors that we've seen, and then maybe as an extension to that, has it changed since the SARB has fully adopted the QPM in its in its public communications?
Okay.
Thanks.
Well, I can partly answer this. Nicola can maybe close, because yes, we also, we didn't check for this in this paper, but for the current work we're doing, we actually are trying to look at the 10 years. And what we're kind of seeing is that, you know, institutional inertia is more important than the governor. So in other words, when you have a governor change at the Reserve Bank, the communicated stance, especially when you adopt the inflation targeting regime, that's when you see a change. And that change has much more persistent through 10 years. So just because Jill is there or Tito is there, it doesn't have a huge bearing on the communication. It's much more slower and has a lot of inertia. And I think this is stock standard central banking, right? It's not to create instability, to create stability and to have kind of predictability. So I don't expect in this instance that, specifically to the question about, you know, whether the communicated stance is matching repo rate changes across 10 years, I would think that it's not the 10 years that matter. It's more about the adoption of an inflation targeting regime would much closely link the communicated stance of monetary policy to their actions in the future. That I would say would be the predominant factor. And so the QPM is a good question, but maybe Nicola can ask. I mean, respond to.
No, but even in the paper with Alberto, I agree with it. And Alberto, really, the difference was really a difference in 3 historical periods of the inflation target. So the implementation of the inflation target that corresponded with the period of Tito Mboweni. And then Gil Marcus was very much after the crisis. And therefore you see a change in communication, because therefore the worries on the real side was much stronger. And then it moves more and more towards, if there is something that can be linked to the QPM, I think is a communication that is more forward-looking. There is more emphatic on expectation, on therefore on this. It is much, I think, after the QPM, this emphasis on interest rate path, expectation. Therefore, if there is a change in the QPM, I think it is that has become a bit forward-looking, at least in terminology. But we haven't particularly checked at that time, but I can imagine that this. But I agree. I mean, there is a lot of persistence. Even the stuff with we were doing with chart, the persistence across documents is. We are looking at the change in documents, but the persistence, the core of the communication is very persistent, like Hylton says.
Great, thank you very much.